InfoTactics in the super election year, the scramble to rebuild trust in the media. My name is Carsten von Nahmen. I'm the managing director of DW Akademie, the Center for Media Development, Journalism Training and Knowledge Transfer of Deutsche Welle, which is Germany's public service broadcaster, international public service broadcaster, I should say. I'm joined today by a panel of impressive personalities. Two you see already, two more will be coming up on the screen. I will introduce them in a moment. But first, let me say that this year's World Press Freedom Day is a very special one. It's special because it focuses on journalism in the face of the environmental crisis, which is a first. But it's also special because this is a very special year. It's a super election year. And this is what we want to focus on in this session here. Half of the world's population will be going to the polls or have already voted, for instance, in Pakistan and Indonesia. Some elections are underway right now, for instance, in India. And many more elections are coming up in South Africa, in Mexico, in the European Union, and in the United States of America, to mention only a few. And while this happens, major disinformation campaigns might be solutions. This is what we want to discuss now with the help of the panel, and let me warn you, that empty chair is there for a reason. I'll come to that in a moment. So, with me today, and I hope we will also see our two colleagues who are with us online in a moment. Let me start with Gwen, a veteran award-winning journalist from Namibia who founded the Namibian newspaper in 1985, which was still at the height of apartheid and the South African occupation of Namibia. And thus she played an important part in the struggle for independence and democracy in her country. Gwen Lister, by the way, co-chaired the UNESCO conference in Windhoek in 1991, which authored the Windhoek Declaration on Free, Independent and Pluralistic Press in Africa, which in event led the UN General Assembly to adopt May 3rd as World Press Freedom Day. So she is one of the reasons why we are meeting here today. Welcome, Gwen Lister.
Thank you.
Also here on stage, and a renowned journalist as well, is Patricia Mayorga from Mexico. She is the co-director of Periodistas de a pie, a network of local journalists in several regions of the country. Patricia has become a prominent figure due to her coverage of forced displacements and disappearances, corruption and organized crime in Mexico. Also welcome, Patricia. And now, hopefully, the other two panelists should be appearing on the screen. I hope. They're not? Okay. No, that's not them. There we go. So, let me start with Marcela. Marcela Ríos Tobar is the Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, an intergovernmental organization. Marcela is a sociologist, a political scientist, and a politician. Some might know her. She was the Minister of Justice and Human Rights in Chile up until a little more than a year ago. And before that, she served, among other things, as deputy representative of the UNDP in Chile for more than 14 years. Marcela now joins us online. Greetings and welcome to you. And last, and certainly not least, to giving us some perspective on the technical side of our topic today, there's Swapneel Mehta. He is a data scientist and founder of the non-profit research collective SimPeople. As a specialist for machine learning and combating online misinformation, he is currently researching platform governance and free speech at Boston University and MIT. And with SimPeople, he aims to improve trust on the social internet, training students, and to build responsible AI tools. I'm really curious about what that is all about. So greetings to Boston and welcome Swapneel Mehta as well. Now, before we actually start, let me unravel the mystery of the empty chair. This is not your ordinary panel discussion. We want you to participate. So in the second half of the event, we will look at three particular aspects of our topic. First of all, regulation of media and social media, the technical solutions for dealing with misinformation and disinformation, and of course, what the media can do themselves to deal with the challenges ahead. So if you have any questions or comments, our two facilitators, Patricia and Isabella, will guide you to the stage, can come up here. If you don't want to appear on stage, it's also possible. You have in front of you this little slips, so you can pose questions, comments on X, formerly known as Twitter. And also there is our YouTube channel at DW Akademie, in one word, with an IE at the end, German writing. So you can also join us there as well. So much for the introduction. Let's get started. And disinformation has been described as the atom bomb in our media ecosystem by Maria Ressa, the Nobel Prize winner, who is also here today. And indeed, disinformation is more than just misleading content. It is intentional and is a coordinated effort to undermine trust and to undermine democracy. But what does that mean in different regions we are dealing with? And let's start with you, Patricia. We are 30 days ahead of the general elections in Mexico. What part does disinformation play? How big is the problem? And is it seen as a problem in your country?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your invitation. Well, in Mexico we have an electoral year, and every time there's elections year, be it federal or local, there's always an increase in violence. And this year, importantly, we should add this mechanism or this information system. And we understand that as a social control, an intentional control system, that in Mexico we're living with polarization consequences, because all powers, be it entrepreneurial, political, or be it the political opposition, and the government itself uses it with through different tools, and basically to disinformate in a more effective way. There are several aspects that they're using, and what we're seeing with big concern, not only in Mexico, but in countries or regions like Central America and South America, is that governments are using public media more and more, like public television, press, written press, obviously internet and radio, to place journalistic content using journalistic tools. This kind of disinformation, what they want to say, and the serious thing is that they're using it to undermine research journalism, in the independent journalism. We're seeing that in a more serious way, and media control through public funding. That's the most serious thing we see for the audience.
And does that mean that trust in public institutions is undermined? Is there trust still in the election process?
It is undermined, but journalism, ethical journalism and independent journalism cannot completely recover this trust from the audience, because media that has bigger penetration is the one that have the highest investment, of course, and they are controlled by a state, be it private or public.
In Africa also, trust is a big issue. About a third of Africa's countries will be going to the polls, and most democracies in Africa are relatively young. Even after independence, often they went through phases of dictatorship now. So, and also the population is very young. So the institutions are maybe not that strong because they're young. The population is very young. They take their information often from social media. Does that mean Africa is particularly at risk from disinformation?
I think it is, Carsten, and most of the experts do say that, you know, digital disinformation is really going to be a problem in Africa in future elections. You're absolutely right to mention the youth. We're talking about elections, especially in southern Africa, in the coming months of this year, where the youth are going to play an absolutely critical role. Namibia's most recent census puts 71% of our population at 35 and under. So obviously the youth are going to be not only critical in the elections that happen, and whether they come out and vote, that remains debatable at the moment, both in Namibia, South Africa, Botswana, Mozambique, where some of the elections are happening. But also their susceptibility, I think, to disinformation is exacerbated by the fact that there is, according to Afrobarometer, obviously declining levels of trust, especially among the youth, in the so-called legacy or traditional media. And I think that opens them up to a very big risk of consuming disinformation. Up to now, there have been no studies, I don't think, in our part of the world as to the kind of depth of deep fakes and AI-generated disinformation, but certainly there's a lot of it happening, mostly attacking credible media institutions at this point.
Let's turn over to Marcela here. You are observing elections. You are right now looking at the upcoming election this weekend in Panama. Looking at Latin America, but maybe also globally, picking up on what Gwen said, do you think that, or do you have information about how much the integrity of elections is affected by the phenomenon of disinformation?
Yes, thank you for the invitation. It's an honor. We are seeing from IDEA's perspective that disinformation, new technologies, and the power of artificial intelligence has transformed democratic deliberation completely. What we see is both elections and democratic processes are being impacted by new technologies and new instruments around the world, and also in Latin America. They provide opportunities, but also several risks. And in that sense, we are seeing, for instance, and I do think that we have to understand that new technologies and artificial intelligence, the use of it in politics and in electoral competitions, might be instruments of polarized political systems, or not necessarily the cause of some of the problems that we're seeing, but instruments that facilitate a certain way of doing politics. And in that sense, throughout Latin America, we are seeing that disinformation campaigns used by populist leaders, by authoritarian governments, or by inescrupulous political actors are hindering people's trust in electoral processes and electoral institutions. So we are seeing a diminishing trust in the electoral process in general, and also in democracy. So this is a very worrisome problem. It's also present here in Panama, in Mexico. We have elections in almost a month from now, June 2nd. We have elections in the Dominican Republic on May 19th. And in all of these countries, we're seeing disinformation campaigns with different levels of capacity on the part of the states to control this disinformation. In the case of Panama, the Electoral Tribunal has set up a specific systems of trying to confront, respond to different citizens' complaints and disinformation campaigns. But what the electoral bodies can do is usually a drop of water in a bucket, in the sense of the amount of information that is circulating and the capacity of formal state institutions to confront them and to reach citizens trying to, counteract disinformation campaigns.
Swapneel, let's turn to you, because we heard now what the problem is, and maybe to counter it, we have to understand how it works. And you at SimPeople, you have been monitoring influence operations on a larger scale. How are these influence operations actually working? We have to understand what the other side does to see what we as media people can do against it.
That's an excellent question, Carsten. So on our end, we started monitoring a bunch of different accounts that promoted state-backed misinformation, independent of country, because honestly, most countries follow similar tactics for state-backed operations. So it doesn't matter what country I name here, there are many countries involved in this. The general trends we see is they coordinated inauthentic behavior is using groups of different accounts to promote similar narratives in seemingly authentic ways. So they want to give off the impression that this is organic engagement, whereas in practice it is not. And we had 3 takeaways that were very interesting to me. To start with, I think the first takeaway was accounts that engage in these activities are not necessarily new accounts. There have been accounts existing on platforms since the birth of Twitter, in this case, since 2007, 8, 9, that are engaging in operations today. And the reason we believe they're engaging in operations is because of the second takeaway, which is we just did counting on large graphs. We didn't throw fancy machine learning at it. We didn't throw fancy AI at it. To be fair, we did all of that later. But initially, we just did counting on large graphs to identify large networks of accounts that engaged in coordinated activity. The challenge is these accounts are buried within very large, very real accounts, and it's really hard to identify a subset of accounts that engage in this kind of activity. But to their credit, in the last few years, platforms have really taken on this challenge head on and started releasing data sets of accounts that they have identified that participated in these activities. The 2 other takeaways I would add is, 1, these accounts really try to cloak their activity, or maybe the simpler explanation is they are bought by other campaigns, because a lot of the accounts we saw promoting state-backed media also promoted Taylor Swift videos from YouTube, or like some Indian influencer videos, and very seemingly innocuous non-political content. And these channels that they promoted content from had 152 billion views. So they were very popular channels. And the last thing I will say is a lot of these campaigns, the bad actors have access to multiple platforms. They can promote cross-platform content in a coordinated fashion. But the platforms are siloed off. Facebook doesn't look at Twitter, Twitter doesn't look at Instagram, Instagram doesn't look at Reddit, Reddit doesn't look at TikTok. So from our end, if we're trying to think about combating it, research data access is incredibly important, because by design, these platforms aren't able to share all of the data that they really could be sharing for whatever business reasons and the reason that they're siloed off.
So we're not only up against the algorithms and state actors, powerful state actors, we're also up against Taylor Swift, so that's probably a challenge which will be hard to overcome. But let's look at the results, Gwen. What are the narratives that you see in your region, particularly in South Africa and Namibia, 2 countries which have been seen as beacons of democracy in Africa for a long time? So what are the narratives coming through these powerful disinformation channels that you see that are worrying you?
Well, I would say in the Namibian context, sort of unlike Swapneel has been describing now, I mean, that will come eventually. I think the disinformation tactics, if I may use the word, are fairly crude still. And they're mainly sort of fake images, either of the front page of a newspaper, trying to pretend that certain stories have been covered, which they haven't, and the discrediting of political opponents in a fairly crude way. So I would say that here in Namibia, that at least. In South Africa, I think slightly more sophisticated. And studies have shown that in the 2019 elections in South Africa, the media in general did a pretty good job of keeping disinformation at bay and kind of at least exposing it through several mechanisms, including media monitoring projects and, of course, fact-checking and the assistance of the South Africa Editors Forum. So I think there's a great awareness of the dangers of disinformation. But perhaps I could add, Carsten, that not only is disinformation a threat or disinformation tactics, but lack of information. And in the Namibian context, certainly we've only recently passed, thanks to the efforts of civil society over a number of years, the Access to Information Law. And many of us journalists, particularly, and activists on the continent, see access to information as a kind of antidote, if you like. If the people, especially the most marginalized, have access to good information they can trust, this in itself will help mitigate the effects of disinformation. So it's early days in Namibia yet. The law has just been passed, and we're hoping it's not just going to be window dressing, but that it's actually going to make a difference in empowering people with the kind of information and knowledge they need to make good decisions, to be participants, fullest participants in the democracy. And of course, that includes the youth.
Yeah. We will be looking at some of the best practices, antidotes, possible solutions for the challenges ahead in a few moments. Reminder, so if you have any questions or comments, please prepare to also come up on stage, or if you don't want to, you can also ask from the audience, but we prefer you to be here to open the circle here of the panelists. But before we come to the solution, let's also maybe look at the problems in other parts. So the narratives in Latin America, are they different from what we see in Africa? Are these disinformation narratives always focused on the specific context, or do you think that there's kind of a global wave of disinformation going? What is your experience in Mexico?
Well,
in Mexico, disinformation has one of the main purposes is the controlled territories, natural resources control. In the narrative in Mexico in the previous years, it's been like a 1,000 heads monster, which is drug dealing. But the relative drug dealers, the groups that form part or the cartel that form part of this drug dealing, they have diversified their activities. The drug is not just a big business. It is, but not the farming drug. Marijuana, amapola has decreased the price now. Basically, the cutting trees is a big business. Mining, the mono harvestings, and this is easier to put a face and responsibility to these politicians and businessmen that are benefit from this, and it has caused more violence, more control, or more aggressions against the journalists and activists, and against strategic groups that make visible this situation. And this has caused what I mentioned at the beginning: the different justice bodies, the state bodies, are used without these digital tools and social networks. They strengthen the information, but basically the control of the justice and the executive control, the legislative control, the different authorities that have criminalized Gustavo Barrit, for example, the journalist from Peru, that now he's denounced and sued by the justice, and not just only because he investigated the case in his country. And he also denounced the corruption in the justice body with a very robust journalism. Gustavo Barrit is an emblematic journalist for us. He's a master of life for us. He's a master of our profession. He's a human being who has taught us not just doing journalism, but living and stay alive. If you want to add to this cause, we have at the back this paper when you can add and sign for and to request justice for him and to suspend these investigations against him. And he can continue to enlighten us. He is facing this situation
in a very weak health situation. He's got cancer, and in spite of that, they have used this situation of health against him to try to weaken him. And this is speaking about an example we got in Latin America. In my country now, they are presenting a book that criminalizes the journalist. Ibida Arbabich is a colleague who was killed in March 23 of 2017, and today they are saying that both we have impeaching the image of the Sinaloa cartel of narco politicians, people who are in jail. And they are actually accusing the government, and they are being accused, and myself, of plagiarism and to try to impeach the names of the criminals. That's the level of the information, and we are accused through our colleagues who are also journalists in a state precinct and with money from the state. So that's the level that this information has arisen in America, Latin America. These are not just examples of what's happening in Central America and Mexico.
For people like me, I mean, in Europe, we often focus on disinformation campaigns by, let's say, Russia, also not only in Europe, but also in other countries where they're trying to play out the so-called West against the rest of the world. But disinformation has many different faces, is used by many different actors. The challenges are many. Swapneel, if we can get him back on the screen, please. I hope you hear me anyway. So we've heard there's very different narratives or very different forms of disinformation. What is the situation in Asia? We had the elections in Bangladesh. There are also campaigns going on against journalists, disinformation campaigns. You have now the elections in India. So what is the situation there in that region, which obviously you also look at?
Thank you for the question. So in Bangladesh, I would say there is, I think it's not just Bangladesh, but at least in that specific case, there is weaponizing of legal mechanisms to try and jail people, arrest the opposing politicians. I think the opposition party in Bangladesh has boycotted the elections, and there were record low turnouts this year, which again is a feature not specific to Bangladesh, but has happened in other countries as well. The situation is fairly, like, there are two sides to this coin. On the one hand, Bangladesh has been a country that's empowered women quite a bit more than comparable countries. It's achieved a number of the Millennium Development Goals. And on one side of the argument is it's at least those things are going well. But on the other hand, trust in the electoral process is almost entirely gone, just because the party has been accused of behaving in an autocratic manner. There were sort of voter, apart from low voter turnout, there were just electoral centers burnt down, schools and voting centers shut down early the day of the elections, and stories on the ground were pretty bad. And from an expectation perspective, like, I would expect the same kinds of things in the Indian elections, not maybe to that extent as obviously, but the other side of the Indian elections is politicians are investing in social media influencers. So now they're showing up on all of these YouTube channels and these shows to sort of peddle influence in different ways. And then there's the deepfakes are a huge problem either way. But I think there are two parts of deepfakes that we're not really looking at as much. Like, one, India being one of the largest countries, one of the largest democracies in the world, the challenge that we're not seeing is people don't even know that deepfakes can exist. They don't even know if synthetically generated media is possible to create. So we've created this monster and we're fighting it. And I agree that that is an important fight to have. But before that, it is on us to also question, like, how many people actually know about this? And then we can try and tell them, no, this happens and you have to stop it, and content authenticity mechanisms exist. So I think for me, it's a two-part problem, like the grassroots problem of literacy about these kinds of harms, and then combating these harms, especially in a multilingual country where these harms can easily be translated into different languages, and it's really, really challenging to just keep track of what is going on. But I do have some solutions that if I have time, I can get into.
We'll definitely get to that, but let me first get to Marcela, and let's now move over. We talked about the problem, let's talk about solutions maybe. From your experience and from what you observe around the world, what are key approaches or best practice that you can highlight to guarantee the integrity of elections, even in the face of all these disinformation campaigns?
Well, I think the good side of this story is that there's a lot of work on trying to confront disinformation, even though it might still seem that it's not enough. There's, on the one hand, a lot of discussion on regulation. The EU has already regulated, has put forth some regulation in terms of the use of artificial intelligence. Brazil in Latin America has been the first country to regulate the use of artificial intelligence in the process of elections and with very strict regulations. So we have a lot of opportunities to look for ways to better regulate the use of these technologies in politics and elections per se. Then we see a lot of proactive work that does not depend on regulation, that has to do with collaboration between electoral bodies and private companies, the owners of the main platforms. And, and in that sense, there is also some work working better in some countries than others. It depends on the capacity of the electoral bodies and the willingness and the presence of these platforms. But for instance, in Mexico, in Latin America, where we have a really strong electoral institution, they have a partner with Mehta, the company that owns Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and something else, Threads. I don't remember what's the other. And they are doing very interesting work in combating, the company putting down false accounts preemptively, putting down information once the electoral body has told them that some information is misleading, putting their own filters. So there's a lot of work on prevention. And then there's also collaboration between civil society and, particularly the media, and where I think that both the media and civil society organizations are promoting in different countries different types of projects to either, disseminate, confront false information, or they're doing, as it was said here, digital literacy to common citizens, to institutions. So there's a lot of work being done on different fronts. I think the most important recommendation that we see necessary is for collaboration, because if you have government, state institutions, the media, civil society, and electoral bodies, and companies all working separately, looking at piecemeal solutions, we're not going to be able to advance systematically or systemically. We do need a lot of collaboration between governments, companies, civil society, and the media to be able to have an impact in an electoral and a democratic ecosystem.
Right, thank you very much. Let's open now the floor, and maybe there are questions, comments here from the audience. We stick with the aspect of regulation. As Marcela said, there are issues. Anyone here, or there's no? Anything coming from X, or? Yes, there's one over here. You want to come up? Please. Well, please come up. It's better, DJ, if you can.
Come on.
Just so everybody does see you.
Breaking the ice.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, we wanted to do this in a more informal setting, but unfortunately we ended up in this stage thing, so it's not really a fishbowl format, but we try to do it like that. So,
yeah, so hello everybody. My name is Khadija Patel, and I'm the chairperson of the International Press Institute. and I do a couple of other things as well. I think that what strikes me when we're talking about regulation and we're talking about all of these things taking place online is the fact that actually for all of us living in places like South Africa and Namibia, I'm South African, what we see is a disproportionate attention to these instances happening in the global north. So, research shows that, it is the more high income, the more lucrative advertising markets that actually get better quality control, right? So, South Africa is somewhere in between. So we're somewhat okay, but we're still not seeing the same kind of quality control for, for bad use of these technology platforms that we're seeing elsewhere in the world. And, when, Gwen talked about, access to information, and I think that increasingly what we have to think about is inequality in access to information that is as much, yes, those of us who have access to the internet and those who don't, but also those of us who will have access to information which has been quality checked and those of us who won't. And I think that's something that, I don't have the answer for it. My answer is that the technology platforms need to be forced to do better. But that's, it's a controversial topic because they basically say this is not our responsibility.
Thank you. Any comments from the panel on this one?
Yes, just to add, no, I agree fully with what Khadija has said. But I think also what we need to do also is really look at the context in which these problems are happening. And especially in Southern Africa, there's incredible rising levels of unemployment. In Namibia, some 50%. South Africa, I'm not quite sure of the statistics there, but it's really bad. And there are problems of corruption and service delivery and all sorts of issues. And this is the sort of milieu in which the youth are getting access to social media and so on, and really often don't have the judgment to judge which is good and which is bad information. So I think it's very important just not to forget the context in which we are, and this is not a sophisticated audience, that can sort of do its own fact-checking.
Right. Right, any other questions or comments on the issue of regulation? Otherwise, we would move on to technology. Swapneel mentioned a few things there. Do we have someone from the audience who wants to join us on that issue? There's one here. Yes, please come up here. On the media. Okay, we talk about the media in a moment. There's one over there. Please come also here, if you like. Also join us on the stage so we can see you. While you're coming up, maybe I can bring in Swapneel again, if we see him here on the screen. Hopefully. Yeah, there you are. Swapneel, we have a guest here. We'll introduce you in a moment. But Swapneel, there was mentioned here that the big media concerns have to be forced to comply and to make sure that they better regulate their own contents. How do you see the chances for that?
I think it's a mixed bag because it depends on where we focus globally. It's very easy to keep a blanket statement and say, hey, they need to do this everywhere. But I think that everywhere doesn't happen because companies haven't invested in staff that even speaks the language in many countries in the world. How do you expect them to effectively moderate content when they don't have anyone on staff speaking the language? And even when they have people on staff speaking the language, what we've heard is they're not able to identify the right sources because they don't have the cultural context. So it's a very deep-seated issue, partially because of the decentralized nature of the spread. And for that reason, the solutions that are emerging are more user-driven than platform-driven. And the goal of the platform, I would say, is to provide those affordances to make user-driven solutions possible. One of those is chatbots and when I say chatbots, I don't mean internet connected language models. That's in fact probably the worst version of the solution. What I mean is language models that have access to verified and authoritative sources of information, that have monitoring and evaluation efforts to examine where they are right, where they're going wrong, that have a consistent and transparent set of metrics that we can use to evaluate them, and most importantly, where we know the training data. Because if you don't know what training data your model has been trained on, it's going to be very hard for you to claim any sort of robustness or performance that translates to an out of domain setting, where like one news organization and other news organizations might get very different results from the same model just because it's been trained on one's data and not trained on the others.
Right.
But I'll pause
So
for
there's
the
a lot.
audience question.
There's a lot we have to learn as media people, which we didn't have to do in the past. So let's introduce our guest. Please introduce yourself quickly and bring us a statement.
Thank you. My name is Kim Robles. I work at the New Zealand Embassy in Chile. And my question, well, thank you very much for your very interesting insights. I wanted to ask you about artificial intelligence. This is something that hasn't legally been addressed in Chile, I think, at the moment, and is a topic that's been exploding a lot during the last years, I think. And I've seen, especially on social networks as TikTok, a lot of videos of authorities, countless videos of President Boric even using Venezuelan shirts, and it's really simple to edit content, videos, image, footage that shows a totally total.
No, go for it. I just wanted to say that I want our other participants on. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you.
Okay. So it's very easy to lead information in a very malicious way. Right. So is there any way that we can address this problem besides the legal factor? It's any way that we can engage with those platforms, or any sort of form of collaboration that we can use to address this problem?
Swapneel, I'll bring that question to you again, I think.
Sure. So there are coalitions attempting to work on this. The big problem, especially in the global south where I come from, is that most of this is done through encrypted platforms. So you don't even know what is being spread until the harm has already been done. So the kind of solutions that are emerging in that space is something we call user data donations. So it's like you as a user are free to donate your data to researchers who then collect this across a bunch of different people and try to understand what the information ecosystem even looks like, to start with the most popular instances of whether it's synthetically generated videos, images, audio, and then try to go to fact checkers or establish transparent verification mechanisms where you and I can audit what the fact checker is doing ourselves and understand how they're actually arriving at this decision of whether this media is manipulated or not. Then we have a bigger problem of distributing those fact checks to the audiences, which is again a big sort of B2C challenge about when you build a fact-checking website, the only people who go to it are people who are actually looking for the answer. But what you really want is the other people who don't even know that there is an answer to go to your fact-checking website and realize
this. Could we use
So
AI to counter AI? Could we use AI to counter AI? Is that a possible solution?
That's what's starting to become the case. So this is an opinion, but like I saw the first paper that's using LLMs to do fact checking and establishing this pipeline about where did it source its fact checks from, that at least allows humans to scale their effort. So then the human's job is not to do this themselves, but just verify whether these models are establishing the right pipeline and employing it to scale fact checks. And then there are models that kind of translate that into answering, like one of the papers that one of my co-advisors here published was using GPT-4 to counter entrenched conspiracy theory opinions. So you can actually conversationally reduce beliefs in conspiratorial theories through the use of LLM. So obviously the counter is you can probably generate these theories and influence people, but the thing is people are already doing that. We just don't know about that, and it'll come out. When it comes out, it's too late to try and find a solution. So it's a fine trade-off between what we're doing with technology to counter technology.
Can I just add that
Sure,
something
please, go
to
for
this conversation? I think it's important that we continue to push for regulation. Of course, the most effective regulation for the platform companies will come from the global north or where the companies are based, you know, but regulating at the country level is also important. I do think that we need to strengthen the accountability of the platforms. I think that we need to make them accountable much more than common citizens. So these platforms can be accountable by releasing information, by collaborating with electoral organizations, and by taking, you know, preemptive measures on their own. Of course, they are doing some of this, and they claim that most of what they're doing is being effective. I think in the sense that we don't have access to a lot of the information to corroborate, it's difficult to know, but I think we need to continue pushing for regulation in each country of the way that these instruments are used during elections for campaigns, and also during other moments of electoral process, so that we can diminish the reach and impact of this information and strengthen the accountability of the platforms. Like I said, the example of Mexico right now, and last thing, using AI to counteract this information. The Mexican Electoral Institute has launched this sort of chat GPT kind of chat box instrument that is called Inés, and citizens can interact with this chat box to ask for, not just ask for information about the electoral process, but also to denounce this information so that both the company and the institute can monitor and follow up.
Okay, thank you. I still people coming in, which is great. Thank you very much for your question. Unfortunately, I think the schedule. Yes, we have a few more minutes, and I would like to look at the issue of what the media can actually what they have to do. Is there one question in the audience also on that? There is one here. Please come, or maybe if you're in the middle of it, you can do it from there. Just looking at the time. And you are clearly.
I'm going to be very brief because the comment was, I found it very interesting. I think that AI is almighty and all-powerful, but it doesn't have the capacity to doubt, and we do once we consume information, and that's where I would like to see if we can elaborate something else. The practice, you know, more practical and less theoretical about precisely how we can get an easy formula so people don't fall into misinformation tactics, and how do we identify that something is being generated by AI or is truthful by some real person?
Thank you very much. Patricia, maybe from your experience on the grassroots level, so to speak, on the local level, so what apart from regulation, using AI, all these, what can we do as journalists on the local level to combat disinformation? What are your solutions there?
Well, from the DP journalism network, there is a coordination, which is a media of alliance of independent media. There are 17 local media producers, and from there we have jumped to traditional media to create independent media. And from there, the first challenge that I would set out to learn how people is disinformed. What are the tools used for this information? More than generation like me that you know, we're a little bit older, and we resist to learn and how to manage new technologies and how AI work, to get closer to experts so we can understand and use those tools to fact check and to combat disinformation, as it is a control mechanism that I mentioned before. And then what we're trying to practice and what is giving us some hope and is really effective is our relationship with audiences. The 17 media outlets, and there are some more, they have become specialized in some topics. We're research journalism, but also we have learned how to use these tools so we can dissect our research with different platforms. And for example, there are intercultural media, where we work with indigenous communities. Through them, we have been more careful and quiet, so we can listen and open our minds and our hearts and learn from community processes, because the communities is where we have more violence, more displacement, and more territorial control happens. If we don't understand those community processes and their cosmovision, where indigenous people live and farming people live, we will not be able to effectively communicate the problems around the country. If we don't understand and we don't do a hyper or local journalism, we will not be able to globally understand the country.
Let us quickly wrap up here. You probably could talk about this for a few more hours, but let's go through here. Started with you on your approach. What do you take out of this discussion? What will you take out here? What needs to be done in your home country, in your home region?
Carsten, I think really for, elections really to be free and fair, people need to be able to access information they can trust. So there's a really huge burden that rests on the shoulders of journalists and journalism. And while we know that that craft is facing its own constraints in terms of financial problems, as well as safety issues for many journalists across the world, which are absolutely critical, I think that there's a lot more that journalism can do to bring positive information to people, not positive information in that sense, but to bring good information to the people. And I look at issues like explanatory or solutions-based journalism, which I think we need to do more of. In Namibia, just very briefly, there's a lot of hype at the moment around the phenomenon of green hydrogen, and it's going to save the country's economy, and it's going to create thousands of jobs. And there's nobody really managing to untangle this whole concept and tell people, is it something that can really work, or is it just another pie in the sky promised by politicians? So I think journalists really can do a lot more and to win back the trust by doing good journalism, because really their task, they don't always have the capacity to combat disinformation. So they should be informing rather than spending most of their time trying to combat fake things that are out there,
yeah.
I would say.
Thank you. Swapneel, hopefully we'll see you again in a moment. What is your takeaway from here, or what is the way ahead from your point of view, especially looking at the solutions?
I think I would have 3 calls to action. One is unlock the power of your data. Be a co-developer of the technology that is going to be driving the news, at least part of the news gathering process going forward, as opposed to just remaining a beneficiary of the technology and waiting for others to take it forward. Number 2, decentralize your news gathering process. We know that a lot of national media outlets rely on the local news organizations and on different sort of efforts they have spread out to gather news. Try to reach out to consumers directly, create mechanisms for people to do reporting directly to your systems, because now you don't have the deluge of information that you can't make sense of. Now you have language models, you can aggregate topics, narratives, incoming tips, do the verification automatically, use those to inform your newsmaking process. And the third thing I would say is, I think Gwen mentioned this a couple of times, like tap into the power of the youth. I think for some people, we've been an organization that is run entirely by undergrads in India without like a formal training in any business development or whatever. And at this point, we've raised grants from Google, Mozilla, Amazon, MIT. We're incubated at MIT's flagship accelerator. We're doing all of these cool things with news and media organizations in 6 different countries, supporting fact-checking efforts in Mongolia. And again, senior year undergrads. So you can really tap into the power of youth in your respective countries and globally to build these kinds of programs. And we've done this in India and the US and the UK. So I can definitely speak to that. If I can do it, all of you can.
Thank you. And Marcela, what is your final assessment here?
Well, I think there's a lot of work to empower electoral bodies around the world so that they can collaborate with private companies and platforms, and also monitor them and ensure accuracy and transparency. From ID International, we're doing exactly that, working with electoral bodies around the world, but also with private enterprises. And I also think that there's a lot of work to do with the media. I think the traditional media sometimes contributes to amplifying this information, and we really need to assure that they have higher ethical standards in the way that disseminate information and that the way they portray and they cover politicians who tend to promote this information. So a lot of work to do, and particularly strengthening partnerships and collaboration across state and civil society.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I think also what we need is a holistic approach. I mean, taking up what you said before, you know, it's not individual measures, of course. We have to react to short-term threats. We at the Academy and our partners around the world, we look at this in a kind of three-sphere model, where the first sphere is the immediate reaction to disinformation. And then, of course, we need to innovate, and we heard that, you can see it here, we need to innovate, we have to create and design new methods to counter disinformation, and we're working on that with our partners around the world, as I said. And the third, of course, is something completely different. We have to educate, and we have to advocate for new ways of dealing with media. So media information literacy, which is another big topic also that has come up at the last World Press Freedom Conference, but also will be a topic this time, is to have a long-term effect. So these are basically for us also, and from what you corroborated here on this panel, is the way forward, to really look at the different areas of disinformation and not just try to catch up with the latest lie, with the latest fake news. Thank you very much. We will be around a little bit more if you want to continue the discussion. I think that's virtually all we have time for now. Yes, and this important campaign also, you can join that. Thank you very much for taking part and for this discussion. To my panelists, thank you very much. Also to the two coming up from the outside. I think it's lunch break time now. Enjoy that, and I'm looking forward to continue the discussion this day, and also tomorrow there are some more side events coming up. Thank you, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Nice meeting you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.